You keep calling it overthinking, but overthinking doesn't feel like this. This feels precise, like your mind isn't just running, it's dissecting. Yesterday, May 3, something shifted in your mental pattern. Not a big visible event, but a subtle disruption. The way you process things broke its usual rhythm. Normally, a thought appears, and you follow it instantly. No gap, no questioning, just reaction. But now, there's hesitation. Not weakness, interruption. A thought shows up, and instead of pulling you in immediately, you pause. Just for a second, but that second changes everything. Because in that second, you see the thought forming, not as truth, as a process. And that's why it feels uncomfortable, because your mind is no longer smooth and automatic. It's being observed while it's happening. Yesterday's pressure wasn't random. It forced your usual mental shortcuts to slow down. The patterns didn't disappear, they became noticeable. And today, May 4, Mercury is sharpening that effect, not by adding more thoughts, but by making the structure of your thinking clearer. You're catching how quickly you assume, how fast your mind builds a story from almost nothing, how certain you feel without actual evidence. And once you see that, something breaks. Not your mind, your blind trust in it. That's the real shift. You're not stuck in your thoughts the same way anymore. You're starting to recognize them as patterns, repeating, predictable, constructed. And that realization is subtle, but it changes how much control they have over you. So no, this isn't overthinking. This is the moment where your mind stops being invisible and starts becoming something you can actually see. And once you see it, you don't go back to reacting the same way again. This didn't feel like growth when it started. It didn't feel like clarity, it didn't feel like improvement. It felt like your mind got louder, more active, more questioning, more restless. Thoughts repeating, scenarios replaying, conversations looping in your head long after they ended. You tried to quiet it. You distracted yourself. You reached for things that used to calm you down. You told yourself, it's just stress, it will pass. But it didn't pass. Because this wasn't something temporary, this was something deeper. Awareness doesn't arrive like peace, it arrives like disruption. It interrupts the automatic flow you've been living in for years. Before this, your reactions were instant. You felt something and you became it. You thought something and you believed it. No distance, no space. But now, there's friction, a slight resistance between the thought and your full identification with it. You notice yourself reacting. You notice your tone, your emotional shifts, your patterns repeating. And that creates a strange discomfort. Because once you notice a pattern, you can't pretend it's not there anymore. And that's the real shift. Not that your mind got louder, but that you became aware of how loud it always was. This is where everything begins to change. Not on the outside, not in your circumstances, not in the people around you, not in the visible structure of your life, but inside the way you experience reality, inside the lens through which everything passes. There's a split now, not a broken one, not something damaged or fragmented, a conscious one, a subtle separation that wasn't there before, or maybe it was always there, just unnoticed. One part of you is still reacting, thinking, judging, interpreting everything in real time. It labels things: good, bad, right, wrong, safe, dangerous. It jumps to conclusions, fills in gaps, tries to predict what will happen next, trying to stay in control. This part feels familiar. It's the voice you've always identified with, the one that narrates your life. But another part is watching, quietly, without forcing anything, without interfering, without trying to fix, control, or suppress what's happening. Just observing. And this observer feels different. It doesn't panic, it doesn't rush to conclusions, it doesn't react instantly or emotionally, it doesn't get pulled into every thought, every feeling, every story your mind creates. It just sees, clearly, directly, without distortion. At first, this feels strange, almost unnatural, because you're not used to it. You're used to being fully inside the experience, fully immersed in every thought, every emotion, every reaction. You didn't notice thoughts, you became them. You didn't observe emotions, you were them. There was no distance, no space, just constant identification. But now, you can feel both at once. The reaction and the awareness of the reaction. The thought and the recognition that it's just a thought. The emotion and the quiet knowing that it's passing through you, not defining you. And that changes your relationship with your own mind more than you realize at first, because thoughts begin to lose their absolute authority. They still appear, they still speak in the same voice, they still try to convince you, they still pull up old fears, old doubts, old patterns, but something has shifted. You don't automatically believe them anymore. There's hesitation now, a pause, a gap between the thought and your reaction to it. And inside that gap is freedom. You start noticing the pattern behind them, the repetition, the predictability, the same types of thoughts showing up in different situations, the same emotional loops playing. Again and again. You notice how certain triggers always lead to certain reactions. How one small thought can spiral into a full emotional state. How your mind constructs entire realities from assumptions that were never questioned, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You begin to recognize that most of what you experience internally isn't new. It's recycled, conditioned, learned, repeated. You realize how much of your thinking is automatic, not consciously chosen, just inherited patterns running in the background. And that realization can feel unsettling, because it challenges the idea that every thought is you. It shows you that much of what you believe to be your identity is actually just habit. Mental habit, emotional habit, behavioral habit. And once that awareness grows stronger, something else happens. You stop reacting immediately, not because you're forcing yourself to stay calm, but because there's now space. Space to see, space to choose, space to not follow every impulse your mind throws at you. You begin to notice urges without acting on them, feel emotions without being consumed by them, hear thoughts without automatically agreeing with them. And this creates a new kind of stability. Not the forced kind, not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but a natural grounded presence. Because you're no longer at the mercy of every internal movement. You're witnessing it, understanding it, letting it pass. And in that process, something powerful becomes clear. You've been living inside a loop of thoughts triggering emotions, emotions reinforcing thoughts, patterns repeating without interruption, the same fears showing up in different forms, the same doubts wearing different masks, the same stories playing in slightly different ways. And before this awareness, you were inside that loop, completely identified with it, believing it was reality. But now, you're stepping outside of it, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, moment by moment. You catch yourself in the middle of a reaction. You notice a thought before it fully takes over. You feel an emotion, and instead of drowning in it, you observe it. And each time you do that, the loop weakens. It loses its grip, because it depends on unconscious participation, it depends on you not seeing it. But now, you see it. And that changes everything. This awareness doesn't destroy your thoughts, it doesn't silence your mind, it doesn't remove emotions from your life, but it transforms your relationship with them. You're no longer trapped inside every experience, You're aware of the experience as it unfolds, and that awareness is your first step outside of the loop, your first step into something deeper, something more real. Not a new identity, not a new version of yourself to perform, but a return to something that was always there, quietly watching, waiting for you to notice. And now that you have, you can't go back to not seeing it. Right now, there's a subtle influence amplifying this experience. Not something dramatic, not loud, not overwhelming in a way that demands your attention, but something precise, something sharp, almost surgical in the way it cuts through your usual way of thinking. It doesn't shake your life externally, it refines what's happening internally. This is where Mercury in astrology becomes important, because Mercury represents perception, not just thinking, but how you think, the way you process reality, the way your mind connects ideas, the way it interprets meaning, fills in gaps, builds stories out of fragments. It governs the internal dialogue you hear all day, without even realizing it's there. And when this energy becomes more active, it doesn't create chaos, it reveals it. It doesn't insert new thoughts into your mind, it exposes the structure of the thoughts that were already there. It increases the speed just enough for you to finally notice the pattern behind the movement. That's why your thoughts feel faster, not random, not meaningless, but accelerated, more layered, more detailed, more complex, more interconnected than usual. It's like multiple threads are running at once. You're thinking about one thing, but underneath it there's another thought, and behind that another assumption forming, and behind that an emotional response beginning to rise. And now, for the first time, you're aware of all of it happening together. That's why it feels difficult to ignore, because before this, most of this process was invisible, automatic, silent. You didn't see how one thought led to another. You didn't notice how quickly your mind constructed meaning. It just happened, instantly, seamlessly, without question. But now, there's visibility. It's like the volume has been turned up, not to overwhelm you, but to reveal the background noise that was always playing. The subtle judgments, the quick assumptions, the immediate interpretations. Things that used to feel like truth now feel like processes. Because before this, you didn't question your thoughts, you followed them, you trusted them, you assumed they were accurate reflections of reality. That if you thought something, it must be valid, it must mean something real. But now, that certainty is dissolving, not into confusion, but into awareness. You start seeing the distortion clearly. You notice how quickly your mind jumps to conclusions, how it fills in missing pieces with assumptions instead of facts, how it predicts outcomes based on past patterns, not present reality, how it reacts before it fully understands. You see how a single, incomplete observation can turn into a full story within seconds. A look from someone becomes a judgment, a delay becomes rejection, a silence becomes meaning. And none of it was verified. It was constructed. And now you can see the construction happening in real time. That's the shift. Not that your mind stopped doing it, but that you became aware of it while it's happening. You begin to notice the micro moments, the instant a thought appears, the split second where interpretation begins, the exact point where assumption replaces observation. And once you notice that, something changes in a very subtle but powerful way. Trust begins to evolve, not collapse, not disappear, but transform. You don't lose trust in your mind, you stop giving it blind authority. There's discernment now, a quiet evaluation, a pause before belief, not in a fearful way, not in a way that makes you doubt everything, but in a conscious way, a grounded way. You start asking, even if silently, is this actually true or just familiar? Is this fact or interpretation? Am I seeing clearly or reacting automatically? And those questions create space. Space between thought and belief, space between perception and reaction. And inside that space, clarity begins to form. You stop believing every thought automatically, not because you're forcing skepticism, but because you can see how thoughts are formed. You see the speed, the layering, the repetition, the patterns repeating themselves with slight variations. And once you see the pattern, you can't fully be controlled by it anymore. Even if it still appears, even if it still pulls at you sometimes. There's awareness now. And awareness interrupts unconscious behavior. It slows down automatic reactions. It gives you the ability to step back, even if just slightly. And that slight distance is everything. Because it gives you choice. Choice to engage or not. Choice to believe or question. Choice to react or observe. And that alone is a massive shift in awareness. Not dramatic on the surface, not something everyone around you will notice, but internally, it changes the entire structure of your experience. Because you're no longer just thinking, you're aware that you're thinking. And once that awareness stabilizes, your mind stops being something that controls you and becomes something you can actually understand. This is where things start to feel unstable, not chaotic in a visible way, but internally something begins to shift out of its usual position. The ground you've been standing on doesn't break, it just stops feeling as solid as it used to, because your identity, the version of yourself you've been living as, was built unconsciously, not intentionally, not carefully designed, not something you consciously sat down and chose. It formed over time, quietly, through repetition, through experience, through patterns you didn't even realize were shaping you. It was built from thoughts you kept thinking, reactions you kept repeating, beliefs you kept reinforcing without ever stepping back to examine them. Small moments stacked on top of each other until they became something that felt permanent. I'm like this. I always react this way. This is just who I am. I can't change this. This is how I've always been. These statements felt solid, stable, reliable, like fixed points you could return to. They gave you a sense of consistency, a sense of knowing yourself. Even if some of those traits didn't fully serve you, they still felt familiar. And familiarity feels safe. So you didn't question them, you accepted them, you built around them, you made decisions based on them, you shaped your behavior to match them. But now, something is different. Those statements don't land the same way anymore. They don't feel as real, not because they've disappeared, but because you can see through them. You can see where they come from. You can trace them back to specific experiences, specific moments, specific patterns that repeated often enough to feel true. You begin to notice how a single thought, repeated over time, turned into a belief, and that belief, repeated through behavior, turned into identity. You see how your mind created consistency, not through truth, but through repetition. And once you see that, the identity begins to loosen, not collapse instantly, not vanish overnight, but soften. It loses its rigidity, its certainty, its unquestioned authority. It becomes something you can observe instead of something you automatically are. You realize you've been acting out a version of yourself, a role that felt natural but was actually constructed, a version built on thoughts you never examined, patterns you never interrupted, reactions you never paused to question. And that realization is uncomfortable because it creates space where there used to be certainty. It creates openness where there used to be definition. And your mind doesn't like that at first. It wants to hold on. It wants to reassert the old identity, to remind you, this is who you are. Don't overthink it. This is just how you've always been. Because identity feels like stability, even if it's limiting, even if it's outdated, even if it's based on patterns that no longer match who you're becoming. Letting go of that, even slightly, can feel like losing something important, like stepping into unfamiliar territory without a clear map. Because if those thoughts aren't absolute truth, if those patterns aren't fixed, then neither is the identity built on them. And that realization doesn't just stay on the surface, it goes deeper. It begins to question everything built on top of that identity. Your habits, your reactions, your preferences, even the way you see yourself in relation to others. You start to notice how much of what you call you is actually repetition, conditioning, learned responses that became automatic over time. And once you see that clearly, a gap opens, a space between who you thought you were and what you're actually observing now. And that gap is where the instability comes from, not because something is wrong, but because something is shifting. You're no longer fully identified with the old version, but you haven't fully stepped into something new either. You're in between, aware but undefined, present but not fixed. And that in-between space can feel uncomfortable because it doesn't give you quick answers, it doesn't give you a clear label, it doesn't give you a stable identity to hold on to. But it gives you something else, something deeper. It gives you awareness, the ability to see without immediately turning what you see into identity, the ability to experience without needing to define yourself through every experience. And from that place, a deeper question naturally begins to form, not forced, not intellectual, but real. If you're not the thoughts, if you're not the patterns, if you're not the repeated identity built from unconscious loops, then who are you? Not the version you've been repeating, not the label you've been carrying, not the story you've been telling yourself, but beneath all of that, before the patterns, before the conditioning, before the repetition began, who are you when you're simply aware? And that question is where the real shift begins. This is the part where most people get stuck, not because they're incapable, not because something is missing, but because this stage feels counterintuitive. Everything you've learned up to this point has been about doing more, fixing more, improving more, controlling more. So when awareness begins to grow, it creates a new desire, a very natural one, the desire to fix everything, to clean up your mind, to organize your thoughts, to remove anything that feels uncomfortable or wrong. You start thinking, I need to control this, I need to stop these thoughts, I need to get rid of these patterns, I need to become calm, stable, clear, all the time. It feels like the next logical step. If you can see the problem, then you should be able to solve it, right? So you try. You try to control your thoughts, eliminate negative patterns, force clarity, hold on to calmness, and push away anything that disrupts it. You become more alert, but also more tense, more aware, but also more effortful. And at first it feels like progress, because you're doing something, you're actively engaging with your mind. But very quickly something else appears. Resistance. Subtle at first, then stronger. Because the more you try to control your mind, the more it pushes back. The more you try to silence a thought, the louder it becomes. The more you try to avoid a feeling, the more persistent it feels. The more you try to force clarity, the more scattered everything seems. And this creates frustration, because it feels like you're doing everything right, but the results don't match the effort. You start questioning, why is this getting harder? Why can't I just fix this? Why does my mind feel even more active now? And that's where the misunderstanding becomes clear. Because awareness doesn't function through control. It functions through observation. And that's difficult to accept, not because it's complicated, but because it goes against everything you've been conditioned to believe. Control feels active, it feels productive, it feels like movement, like progress. It gives you the sense that you're shaping your experience. While observation, at first glance, feels passive, like you're doing nothing. Just watching, just allowing, just letting things be as they are. And that can feel uncomfortable, even frustrating, because your mind wants to interfere. It wants to step in, to fix, to adjust, to improve. But observation isn't passive, it's precise, extremely precise. Because when you observe without interference, without trying to change what's happening, you begin to see clearly, not through effort, but through direct experience. You start noticing things you couldn't see before. How thoughts arise, not randomly, but from subtle triggers. A memory, a word, a sensation, a past association. You see how a single thought doesn't just appear. It builds, it forms layers. One idea connects to another, one assumption leads to another, and before you know it, a full narrative is created. You begin to notice how emotions attach to those thoughts, how a simple interpretation can shift your entire state, how quickly the mind moves from neutral observation to personal meaning. And then you notice something else, how those thoughts don't stay, they fade, they dissolve, they lose intensity without you doing anything, without forcing them away, without suppressing them. They rise, they peak, and they pass, just like everything else. And in that process, something important becomes clear, something you don't fully understand intellectually at first, but you begin to feel it directly. You don't need to fight your mind, because fighting creates more movement, more tension, more identification. Fighting keeps you inside the pattern, but observation takes you outside of it. You begin to understand your mind not as something to control, but as something to see, something to learn from, something that reveals itself when you stop interfering. You see its habits, its tendencies, its automatic reactions. You see how it repeats the same structures in slightly different forms. And once something is clearly seen, truly seen, it begins to lose its unconscious power, not because you forced it to change, but because it can no longer operate in the dark. Its strength was in invisibility, in automatic repetition, in you not noticing it. But now, you notice. You see the beginning of a thought, the middle of it where it's trying to go, and that awareness interrupts the loop gently, naturally, without effort, without struggle. And over time, this changes everything. Because instead of trying to control your mind, you understand it. Instead of trying to eliminate thoughts, you see through them. Instead of trying to force stability, you discover a deeper kind of stability, one that isn't dependent on what your mind is doing. And that shift, from control to understanding, from force to observation, is where real transformation begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, steady, and real. Let's be honest about this part. This doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels like something is slipping away. Your certainty, your stability, your sense of identity. Because the old version of you was familiar, predictable. It followed known emotional patterns. It reacted in ways you understood. Even if those patterns weren't ideal, they were comfortable. But now, that comfort is breaking. You pause where you used to react instantly. You question where you used to assume. You see layers where you used to see simplicity. And that creates a strange feeling, like you're in between versions of yourself, not fully who you were, but not yet fully who you're becoming. And that in-between space feels uncertain. But it's also necessary, because transformation doesn't happen by adding something new. It happens by seeing through what was never real to begin with. There's a point in this process where everything starts to settle, not because your thoughts disappear, but because your relationship with them changes completely. You realize something simple, but deeply powerful. You were never trapped by your thoughts. You were identified with them. An identification is what made them feel real, permanent, defining. But once that identification loosens, even slightly, space appears, and that space changes everything. Because in that space, you're no longer reacting automatically. You're choosing. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to feel the difference, enough to recognize that. You're not bound to every thought that passes through your mind. And that realization, it's quiet, but it's life-changing. So no, you're not overthinking, you're becoming aware of thinking. And that distinction matters more than you realize. Because awareness is the foundation of everything that follows. Clarity, choice, change. Nothing outside needs to shift immediately. You don't need to force transformation. Because once you see clearly, your actions begin to align naturally, without pressure, without force. So if your mind feels different right now, if things feel more intense internally, if you're noticing patterns you never saw before, that's not a problem. That's progress. Not the loud kind, not the visible kind, but the kind that changes everything quietly, from the inside out. And once that process begins, it doesn't reverse, because you can't unsee what you've already seen. You can't go back to unconscious patterns once awareness has touched them. So this isn't confusion, it's clarity in motion. And the more you stay with it, the more stable it becomes. Until one day, without forcing anything, you realize you're not trying to control your mind anymore. You're not lost in it either. You're simply aware. And from that awareness, everything else begins.